Hi, I'm Rodney Johnson, co-editor of Boom and Bust as well as Economy and Markets. The 1973 Arab-Israeli War only lasted 19 days, but the effects are still with us 40 years later. One of the biggest outcomes was the acknowledged power of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or more specifically, the power of the Arab nations within that cartel. Shortly after the war began, these nations imposed a ban on selling oil to several other nations, including the United States, in retaliation for supporting Israel. The embargo didn't end with the fighting. It lasted until March of 1974. In that time, the price of a barrel of oil shot from $3 to almost $12. Given that oil production in the U.S. peaked around 1970 while we kept consuming more, the Arab OPEC nations realized they had the power to force us and other nations to pay a lot for oil. That started the greatest wealth transfer in the history of the world. The oil embargo caused near panic in U.S. political circles, where the government reacted with a mixture of policy initiatives and price controls. It resulted in gas rationing, long lines at filling stations, and the creation of the Department of Energy. And they put in place a ban on exporting raw oil from the U.S. A lot's changed in 40 years. We've made great strides in cutting oil consumption per person and even saw total U.S. oil use decline recently. At the same time, domestic producers made great strides recovering massive amounts of fossil fuel from rock formations through fracking. These trends mean that the United States can meet more of its oil demand from internal sources. Sort of. The problem is that most of what we recover here is called light sweet, or West Texas Intermediate, whereas much of what we import is heavy sulfur, or Brent. U.S. refineries brought on after 1970 were made for Brent, that heavy sulfur stuff, and unfortunately you can't just switch between the two. This means that our refining capacity for West Texas Intermediate, which we create a lot of, has been swamped by local supply. Since we still have this embargo on exporting raw oil, except to nations with a free trade agreement, there isn't much that oil producers can do, until now. Earlier this year, 2 oil companies received private rulings allowing them to export something called condensate, a very light form of oil. This will allow these companies to sell limited quantities of raw oil to the international market. Now, these sales won't move the needle themselves, but the concept of lifting the embargo has a dramatic effect. Expect our prices to go higher. When U.S. producers are allowed to sell their raw oil to the rest of the world, the price of West Texas Intermediate, which has been low, should reconnect with Brent crude, which has been higher. The difference came about because we had such an oversupply here locally that we couldn't do anything with. It only stands to reason when we can sell the excess supply on the world markets, there will no longer be this overhang, and so the cost of locally sourced oil will move up. We can expect the price at the pump to follow suit. This isn't a judgment on whether we should or shouldn't lift the embargo. It's simply an assessment of what's going to happen when the embargo is dismantled. I expect the same thing to happen when natural gas liquefaction and exports finally get underway in 2015, as supply is siphoned off by the world market and sold at a higher price. All of this means we should be prepared for the equalization of world prices as the sudden bulge in supply gets drained away. If prices for oil and natural gas remain high in the years to come, we'll face higher costs for gasoline, heating oil, and electricity generated from natural gas. All of this will take more money out of the pockets of consumers at a time when wages are falling behind inflation, which leads to another drag on consumption and a drag on the economy. This is a negative for the economy as a whole, but it leads to big profits in the energy sector. It provides investors with a potential pocket full of profit from what is otherwise a very costly turn of events.